That is the great question. Will I ever be able to write anything great? Will I ever become a journalist or a writer? I hope so. I hope so very much. For I can recapture everything when I write. My thoughts, my ideals, and my fantasies.
Even though Anne Frank died before her dream came true, she did become a writer in a very special way. In her diary, which she named Kitty, Anne Frank described what happened to her and her family during the war. She tells a story of how she and all the Jewish people suffered. When the war ended, her diary was published and read all over the world. Parts of her diary have been painted on the walls of the school she went to, which is now called the Anne Frank School. Here's her classroom. There were 13 Jewish children in Anne's class, and all except for 2 of these children died in the war. For every child, there is a story. There are 6 million stories for each of the 6 million Jews that died. We only know Anne's story because of what she wrote. Anne's diary is now kept in the house in Amsterdam where she and her family hid from the Germans. The house is called the Anne Frank Museum. Anne began her diary on June 14th, 1942. After she filled the first book, she continued to write in exercise books. There is also an album of photographs which, along with the diary, tells the story of her life.
My father did not marry until he was 36, when my mother was 25. My sister Margot was born in 1926, and I followed on June 12, 1929.
The Frank family was German. They came from a place called Frankfurt on the Main. Anne and Margot were the last of many generations of Franks to live here. Anne's father was from a wealthy Jewish family that had lived in Frankfurt for hundreds of years. Many of the oldest families in Europe were Jewish. Though Jewish people had been allowed to live in peace in Frankfurt for many years, there has always been a history of prejudice against the Jews in Europe. Throughout the ages, they had often been mistreated. Their homes were broken into and looted. Sometimes they were even murdered. At the time when Anne was born, this hatred had risen to a peak in Germany. The Star of David was painted on the windows of shops belonging to Jews. Members of a political party called the Nazis gathered outside these shops to stop people from entering. They often drove through the streets, intimidating people.
Unsere eigene Nation, unseres eigenen Volkes liegt. In uns selbst allein liegt die Zukunft.
The leader of the Nazis was a man named Adolf Hitler. He became the most powerful man in Germany by feeding the people's fear and hatred. He tried to blame all the things that were wrong in Germany, like high unemployment and poverty, on the Jews. And because the Germans were so dissatisfied and angry, because there were no jobs and no money, they believed Hitler. Many German people started to believe that if they voted for Hitler, he would be able to make their lives better and things would be right again. Hitler received enough votes to become the Prime Minister of Germany. His obsessions with the Jews grew until he planned to kill them all. He felt there was only one kind of perfect people and that all others were inferior. As soon as Hitler came to power, new rules were put into force. Anyone who disobeyed the strict rules that the Nazis enacted was immediately arrested and sent to a concentration camp. The Jews suffered the most. At school, their children were humiliated and eventually expelled. Men and women could not find jobs. Their stores were destroyed, and their synagogues burnt to the ground. It was impossible to live peacefully in Germany, and many Jews left. They fled from their homes and abandoned everything that they had spent their lives doing to go to other countries where they would be safe. The Frank family left Frankfurt in 1933 and went to Amsterdam. Anne was 4 years old. They moved to a house in a new housing estate in South Amsterdam called the Merwedeplan. At first, things went well for Anne and Margot in their new house. They learned to speak Dutch quickly and became used to a life without discrimination. Many Jews had moved to Holland from Germany at this time, and they felt safe there. Although there was a small Dutch Nazi party which didn't have much popular support, the Jews were able to live their lives normally in Holland. Hitler was not satisfied to lead only Germany and soon talked about conquering all of Europe. First, he invaded Austria and Czechoslovakia. When he sent German troops into Poland, Britain and France finally declared war. The government of Holland refused to take sides and insisted that Holland would stay out of the war. However, on May 10th, 1940, the German army invaded Holland. For 4 days, the Dutch fought back. Hitler then bombed the city of Rotterdam and forced them to surrender.
After May 1940, good times rapidly fled. First the war, then the capitulation, followed by the arrival of the Germans. This is when the sufferings for us Jews really began. Anti-Jewish decrees followed each other in quick succession. Jews must wear a yellow star. Jews must hand in their bicycles. Jews are banned from trains and forbidden to drive. Jews are not allowed to enter public sports grounds like swimming baths. Jews must be indoors by 8 o'clock and cannot even sit in the gardens after that hour. Jews must go to Jewish schools and many more restrictions of a similar kind.
Sometimes it seemed to Anne that everything was forbidden. Here is Anne's textbook from the Jewish school she went to. She and Margot tried hard to live normal lives, but it was difficult. During this time, Anne's father was able to continue working, although he was not allowed to run his own business. He knew that things were getting worse. Jews were starting to receive letters telling them to go to a camp in Holland. From there, they were sent to so-called work camps in Germany. These letters of registration were surrounded by all sorts of rumors because no one was sure what happened in the camps. Some people said that thousands of Jews were being killed, but this story seemed too unbelievable and many Jews registered anyway. When they registered, they were only allowed to take a few things with them. Then they had to wait, not knowing what would happen. If you got a letter of registration and you did not go, you could be severely punished. Many Jews planned to hide from the Germans because they thought that it was dangerous to register. Mr. Frank was among them. He prepared a hiding place in the factory where he worked in Prinsengracht. Some of the people who worked there helped him. Miep and Ellie were the secretaries in the office of Mr. Koppos and Krauler. Under the office was a storeroom where spices were packaged. The workers in this room were told nothing about the plans for the hiding place because of the need to keep everything secret. The hiding place was above this room. The entire building was really made up of 2 houses, a front house and a back house. In this photo, you can see that the house is surrounded by many other houses. This makes it difficult to tell from the outside that there is a back part of the house. The back house was empty, except for a sink in one of the rooms that had at one time been used as a laboratory. There was nothing else in the house at all, because no one had used it in many years. Mr. Frank offered to share the hiding place with his friend, Mr. Van Daan, and his wife and son, Peter. Later, they were joined by Mr. Dussel. After all the preparations were completed, a letter of registration arrived from Margot on July 5th, 1942. The family moved to the hiding place the following day. Anne describes the hideaway in her diary.
From the street door runs a really steep Dutch staircase. The entrance to our hiding place is well concealed. Mr. Krauler thought it would be better to put a bookcase in front of our door, but of course it had to be a movable bookcase that can open like a door. No one would ever guess that there would be so many rooms hidden behind that door. On the left, a tiny passage brings you into a room which was to become the Frank family's bed-sitting room. smaller room, my study and bedroom. Behind that, a little room without windows containing the wash basin and a small WC compartment. If you go up the next flight of stairs and open the door, you're simply amazed that there could be such a big light room in such an old house by the canal. There's a gas stove in this, and a sink. This is now the kitchen and also the bedroom for the Van Daan couple, beside being the general living room, dining room, and study. A tiny corridor room will become Peter Van Daan's apartment, above which there is a large attic. So there you are. I've introduced you to the whole of our beautiful secret annex.
Even though there were always people around her, Anne often felt lonely. She didn't feel she could talk about her feelings to anyone. She felt that Mr. Van Daan was too arrogant and Mrs. Van Daan talked too much. Anne and Mr. Dussel often argued. She was annoyed by her mother's habit of always presenting Margot as a good example for her. At first, she did not like Peter. Although Anne did feel close to her father, she still did not tell him everything. Her diary was the one place where Anne could discuss all her feelings openly. She even gave it a name.
Dear Kitty, I hope I shall be able to confide in you completely, as I have never been able to in anyone before. And I hope that you will be a great support to me.
In the second year of hiding, Anne changed her mind about Peter. The two of them would sit together next to the attic window.
Nearly every morning I go to the attic where Peter works to blow the stuffy air out of my lungs. From my favorite spot, I look up at the blue sky, the chestnut tree, and the seagulls as they glide on the wind. We breathe the fresh air, look outside, and both feel that the spell should not be broken with words.
These feelings of happiness were few. Always they feared discovery. They had heard stories of how many people were being sent to concentration camps.
Countless friends and acquaintances have gone to a terrible fate. Evening after evening, the green and gray army lorries trundle past. The Germans ring at every front door to inquire if there are any Jews living in the house. In the evenings when it's dark, I often see rows of good, innocent people accompanied by crying children, walking on, bullied and knocked about until they almost drop. No one is spared. Old people, babies, expectant mothers, the sick, each and all join in the march of death. If it is as bad as that in Holland, how then do they have to live in the distant and barbarous regions where they are being sent? Radio London talks of people being gassed, and I am afraid.
After 2 years in hiding, an anonymous phone call was made to the police saying that there were Jews hidden in the back house. The house was searched. And the hiding place discovered. All of them were taken to Westerbork in Holland. Although most of the valuables in the house were taken, the diary was left behind. Miep, the secretary, saved it. From Westerbork, Anne was put on a train to the concentration camp at Auschwitz. The train she took was the very last one to leave Holland. There were almost no Jews left there anymore. The train ride lasted 4 days. The prisoners were given no food or water. As soon as they reached Auschwitz, they were examined to see if they were strong enough to work. Mr. Van Daan, who was weak and sickly, was sent immediately to the gas chambers. Here he was put in a room that was filled with poisonous gas. Mr. Dussel was also gassed. Mrs. Frank died of sickness and exhaustion at Auschwitz. Mr. Frank stayed in a sickness barrack until the end of the war. And Peter died at one of the work camps, but no one can be sure which one. As the Russian liberators moved towards Auschwitz at the end of the war, the Germans moved many people to other camps. Anne and Margot were taken to the Bergen-Belsen camp. The conditions here were even worse than at Auschwitz. Every single day, thousands died from sickness or disease. Margot died first, and then Anne was left completely alone. In March of 1945, only 1 month before the war ended, she died. These are the films that the British Army took of Bergen-Belsen when they came to free the prisoners. The soldiers buried the dead and then burnt the camp to the ground. Hitler committed suicide rather than surrender, and the war ended. The German armies were defeated and the soldiers returned to their homes. There were weeks of celebrations around the world as families welcomed their loved ones back. But for some, there was no joy. As the survivors came back from the camps, some had lost their entire families. Otto Frank was the only one from the secret annex to live. As soon as he got back to Holland, he contacted his friends and he waited for news of his family. He lived with Miep Gies and her husband. For weeks, he did not know whether anyone had survived. But one by one, the Red Cross told him that they were all dead. Miep gave him Anne's diary. It was his one reminder of Anne and the days they had all spent in hiding. At first, he had no thought of getting it published, but everyone who read it was so touched that he was convinced that it should be published so that the whole world could read about Anne.
You've known for a long time that my greatest wish is to become a journalist someday, and later a famous writer. In any case, I want to publish a book entitled The Annex after the war. Whether I shall succeed or not is still an open question, but my diary will be a great help in it.
Of all the books that have been written about the war, Anne's is the most famous.
It's really a wonder that I haven't dropped all my ideals, because they seem so absurd and impossible to carry out. Yet I keep them because in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. I simply can't build up my hopes on a foundation consisting of confusion, misery, and death. I see the world gradually being turned into a wilderness. I hear the ever-approaching thunder, which will destroy us too. I can feel the sufferings of millions, and yet, if I look up into the heavens, I think that it will all come right, that this cruelty too will end, and that peace and tranquility will return again.